Professor Jibrin Ibrahim joins us next. He is a senior fellow for CDD and a member of CDD's Election Analysis Center. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for coming on today.
Good morning.
What a time we have on our hands, election eve, so all sorts of emotions we'll be going through right now, from those who are seeking our votes to those who will be voting, if you will, electoral officers themselves, security agencies, all sorts of people, actually. Even the eyes of the international community is on Nigeria at the moment for these elections. You, your team, you've been looking at this whole process, how it will pan out. So if you could just oblige us, what sticks out for you from what you've seen so far?
I think the first issue is that this is an election that has been very well planned. At the legal level, the fact that finally, after 5 attempts, the Electoral Act 2002 was passed with significant improvements to the voting process was a major milestone. I think, secondly, the massive registration of new and especially young voters indicated a significant civic evolution in Nigeria. A lot of young people who had previously thought it's enough to just express your political views on Twitter or Facebook finally got the message that you need your PVC, you need to be an actor in the electoral and democratic process. So that's a huge new thing. And that creates an excitement, because the fact that you have a new generation of voters means there could be an evolution in terms of electoral outcome. I think the third issue is that Inec itself has done its planning extremely well. In a context of the challenges we all have, they are ready for the elections. But the big story is, of course, Nigerians have shown they are eager to choose the next set of leaders. And that's what elections is all about, for you to determine those who exercise power on behalf of the people.
When you say Inec has done extremely well, I'm sure you carefully use those words, but we always hear them say they've done what they can at every election cycle. But on that day, logistics and some of these teething problems seem to rear its head regularly. So when you say they've done extremely well, are you also factoring in the possible challenge that logistics may have on these elections?
Yes, you know, the problem with elections is that one stakeholder alone, Inec, doesn't determine everything. For example, Inec hires commercial vehicles to carry its materials for voting and to take its staff to the polling units. If 2 or 3 vehicles that have already been procured and paid for don't turn up, or if they have a breakdown, then it's not something in Inec's hands. And often that's the type of problems that arise. Some of the anticipated problems this time around were whether they will have cash to pay for these logistics. Luckily, that has been settled, as the Inec chairman has said. They were given the cash they needed. So it's always important when you look at elections to know that the outcome will depend on what every actor does. So you have Inec as one actor, you have the security agencies who have the responsibility to provide a secure environment. You have the voters who have to behave in accordance with the guidelines set out by Inec. So if everyone plays their part, then you have perfect elections.
You know, the last general elections, after it was postponed, and Inec chairman spoke, he did say that we needed to have a conversation about election management in the country. But ever since then, I'm not sure that has happened. How should we approach that?
Well, what he meant is that we needed to transform the management of election in this country from the omnibus model that we have, where Inec has responsibility for everything, for running political parties, for registering voters, for organizing the elections itself. And that Inec should be reduced, its role should be reduced specifically to election management. And what he was explaining is that there were a number of proposals for laws that will reduce the burden on Inec. One of it was to set up the Electoral Offences Tribunal, for example, and that will take from the hands of Inec the responsibility to prosecute electoral offenders. Another proposal that has been in the National Assembly was to set up a political party regulatory agency so that INEC won't spend so much time trying to sort out the problems within political parties and could therefore just focus on election management. That is still on the table. It has been on the table since we proposed it in the Electoral Reform Committee in 2008. These were the proposals we made. I was a member of the committee with Festus that you have just spoken to. We said, look, INEC does too much. Reduce the burden, let other agencies take it, then it will be better able to focus on election management.
Well, let me take you up on the issue of democracy itself. Right now, shall I say, we are celebrating 24 years of unbroken democratic rule. For a number of people, there's still questions about, what it is that our democracy is really delivering, if it's maturing. Yes, we do know that a number of people, in fact, a significant number of people have registered to vote and have picked up their PVCs. But would you really say that it's having an effect on our democracy?
I think the first issue is that democracy is something that has value in itself. It's about freedom, it's about choice by citizens, it is about the community as a whole participating in deciding who runs that society. And because of that value, democracy is always a good thing. But democracy is always a process. It's never perfect. It's always in construction. And a lot of problems arise in the process of democracy. From the point of view of citizens, they often ask themselves the question, what are the democratic dividends I'm gaining from this democracy? Is democracy enough to just say once in 4 years I can vote? I want to see a situation, that's what the citizen will tell you, where when I choose somebody, that person delivers on the promises they make in the electoral campaign. Often, that's not the case. So people get discouraged that, well, this democracy has not gone as far ahead as I would want it to be. And that, for every democratic country, is the dilemma. Some are able to perform better than others, but the core issue, apart from the intrinsic values of democracy, is that democracy should also deliver something material for the benefit of the people.
Well, I am wondering, when we continue to look at over the next couple of days, there will be lots of analysis. There will be analysis of, permutations on, and I'm sure a lot of political parties have already done that already, how they expect that voters will vote, the kinds of things that could sway, I'm not talking about vote buying now, but the kinds of things that will sway voters, how voters have voted in the past, and the kinds of things that influence them in that regard. Now, some people have even argued that voting by itself is even, the things that influence voters are usually emotional decisions. For you, how do you think we can move into, where we begin to actually, incorporate, have more rational decisions taken by voters rather than this sort of almost predictable analysis we can make along the lines of ethnicity and religion?
You see, since the advent of democracy, one of the core debates that we haven't been able to resolve is what is the basis on which the voter makes their choice. And there are two issues. One is the rational choice theory, that the voter calculates this person is likely to deliver perfect administration, or is likely to build a dam for our community, or will whatever. So I'll vote that person in. That's the rational choice theory. The other part of it is that for very many voters, they also have emotional needs when they go to express their choice in terms of leadership. And that could very well be, oh, this man is very handsome and I like handsome men, so I'll vote for him. Or this person is from my ethnic group, we speak the same language. I have some feeling that if people from my ethnic group are there, it may be better for me, it may not be, but in any case, you are keeping it home. So this is the emotional content that often voters face when they go to vote, and that's always in conflict with what one could call a purely rational choice approach. But at the end of the day, what is voting is that people choose the one they like. So you can't remove emotion and you can't remove rationality. It's always a combination of the two.
You said people vote the one they like. Sometimes people vote the one they think will win. I mean, I don't. It's usually quite complex. You know, some people will say, "Oh, this your candidate cannot win. Don't waste your vote." I don't know whether we've ever been able to. And maybe some people say that that's one of the things that we need to work on in our democracy. The concept that you know, a winner takes it all. Do you think that other votes, you know, should count for something?
Well, I think there's this logic of what they call avoiding the wasted vote. That is to say, there are three candidates. One has zero chance of winning, and the real choice is between the other two. So many voters will make the calculation. I like 3, but he has zero chance. If I vote for that number 3, I'm wasting my vote. Let me therefore do a useful vote by choosing between number 1 and number 2. So that's the wasted vote theory that often affects voters as they go to take those decisions. They don't take their best choice, they take the next level choice, but by so doing, they block one that they feel they do not want at all. So they are still looking at what's likely to be the outcome, because at the end of the day, a government will emerge, somebody will be elected. If you can't get the one you prefer the most, then you get the next one on the...
Should that count for anything? I mean, wasted votes. Should we have that?
Well, the issue with an election is that, in theory, an election is open. Anybody contesting can win. But we do know that many people who don't have any likelihood of winning still want to contest. In that case, they insert themselves into the field while they do not actually have the capacity to go far. That's a constitutional right. Everybody has the right to present themselves for citizens to choose from. So you can't really quarrel about that. But what is important at the end of the day is that the voter, who is the one that makes the determination, takes into consideration capacities, competencies, emotional needs, and decides on that basis.
But Prof, do you think that, because several people think that if you actually sample different voters, different categories in the society, and the reason for which they vote compared to what they expect doesn't actually match up. Some of them, I mean, as Mark was talking about, some emotional reasons, and you just wonder, Is this really where our democracy is? Can we make any headway, any major impact on the kind of leaders that emerge if we keep voting this way?
You see, the important thing in voting is that the voter should look for competence. That's what we in civil society always say. That's what Democrats always say. Look for the person that will deliver the best outcome in terms of governance. But this is also a question of rights. A human being may decide, well, I don't care whether the person I elect has competence. I want somebody with whom I share the same religious faith. Our Constitution and our laws gives that person that right, and nobody can take that away from them. So the issue about democracy is that you'd want to find a situation where the majority, whose decision determines the outcome, would look at the most important things for the benefit of society and vote on that basis.
I know that, I mean, within your team, you pour through a lot of data and you analyze them as they come in from different areas, depending on the circumstance. What would you consider to be either factors or defining moments, factors that can influence who emerges in this election?
Well, at the level of CDD, we have looked at a number of factors that will determine the elections. One is the security situation in the country. There is a lot of insecurity that affects many parts of the country. That could affect the ability of voters to come out. The second issue we've looked at is the identity politics of this country. That for all of our political history, questions of ethnicity, of region, of religion have always affected politics in this country, at least since the 1951 elections, but specifically since the 1959 federal elections that produced the first government. The third factor we feel is information, the information space. One of the specificities of this election is that fake news has really influenced the way in which the campaigns went on. There's a lot of manipulation. Festus Okoye, the Inec commissioner that just left here, we have seen on the social media a press release apparently from him with his real signature on it, and it turned out it was just a fake somebody put together. And Festus himself had to issue a release saying, I never issued that so-called release. So there's a lot of manipulation. And when this manipulation also often has to do with emotive issues, then it becomes a major factor in the election. The fourth issue we've considered and we think will be a major role has to do with inter-party and intra-party conflicts. We've never had an election in this country where within some political parties there's so much friction and conflict in the same party. You've seen in the PDP, for example, where they have a group of governors fighting the presidential candidate of the party. We've seen over the past 8-9 days within the ruling APC party how some leaders of the party, including governors, have been contesting the president who comes from the same. So the intra-party dynamics has been really, really very central in these elections and is defining the way in which outcomes are emerging. So these are some of the key factors we think will determine the outcome of the elections.
All right, Buki, Kaede, go ahead.
Right. I mean, it's quite interesting hearing some of those theories that explain how people make their decisions. I think we need to have a proper sit down to go through those theories, because it looks like with democracy, competence is subjective. It's not clearly defined. People can define what competence is from their own point of view. But I'd like you to speak to a point that I came across recently. I was at a gathering and someone was sharing their findings. They realized that some voting population just focus on just voting. They see that as the only form of participation in government that they have. And once they are done with it, that's it for them. They wait up until the next 4 years where they do it religiously again. And I'd like you to speak to what should happen after the elections. I mean, people would win, some would lose. In fact, more people would lose than the ones that win. And we still have a government to run. We have a nation to run, regardless of who wins or who loses. So for a moment, maybe we can take our attention off the elections and focus on governance after the elections. What should the people do after these elections? I think that can help with some form of, preparation of the minds for people.
In 2015, what the Center for Democracy and Development did was to produce what we call a Buhari meter. That is, we tracked the campaign of then candidate Muhammadu Buhari and recorded all the things he had promised to do if he wins the government, if he wins the election. Immediately he won, we then published his promises to Nigerians. And to our shock, the first thing we witnessed was a press release from Garba, who was spokesperson to President Buhari, castigating us for reminding Nigerians these are promises. He dissociated the president from those promises. But these are promises we have recorded. They were said in rallies. They were said in, some of them were in the manifesto and all that. And that for us was a very bad sign. And that also showed us the path to follow. The responsibility of every citizen is to listen carefully to the campaign promise of candidates and to record them, to be aware of them, so that when they are voted into office, we can start making demands as citizens. You said you'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How come nothing is happening on those 5 promises? Any democracy where politicians feel they can promise anything they want and then they are not accountable to perform that promise if and when they get elected, will have very serious problems of legitimacy and credibility. So we always say, map what the candidates are saying, record them, and pose those issues continuously after the elections to hold that candidate or that elected person responsible. Don't forget, our Constitution has a provision that if citizens elect somebody into a legislature and is not performing, they have the right of recall to go back, get petitions. If they get enough petitions, they go to Inec and say, we want that person removed. He made promises he's not fulfilling, and we want to vote another. Nigerians have never succeeded so far in using that right of recall clause in the Constitution. But it's something that we should always be reminded about. Of course, the ultimate issue is, well, for a lot of people, they feel it's too much energy and work to try to remove somebody in government, either through the legislature, if the person is in the executive, or through direct recall, if the person is in a legislature. So they tend to wait for 4 years. And that, I think, is always a problem in a democracy. Because if somebody is elected and nothing is done for those 4 years that he is or she is in office, then that person will be encouraged to continue with the bad behavior of not keeping to promises. These things are, of course, complicated. Sometimes people make promises they think they can fulfill, and when they get into power, they realize it's very complicated. I remember the recording we did of Buhari's campaign speech in Lokoja in 2015, where he said his focus is industrialization and Ajakuta must come on stream immediately he comes into power. Comes into power, sets up a Ministry of Iron and Steel Development, and they find there are lots of complications in the Ajakuta story. They worked hard for 8 years. I think they didn't work hard enough, but at the end of the day, the point I'm making is that they were not able to deliver. Yeah. So this question of accountability, political accountability, is extremely important in sustaining democratic regimes.
Also a pleasure to have you, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow, CDD, and a member of CDD's Election Analysis Center. Thank you very much indeed today, sir.
It's always a pleasure.
All right, we will be back in just a moment. Stay with us.